March 1st, 1943, 25,000 feet above the North African desert, the sky erupted in violence. Lieutenant Kendrick R. Bragg, Jr. felt his B-17 Flying Fortress shudder as if struck by an invisible giant's fist. The sound came next. Metal screaming against metal, rivets popping like gunfire, aluminum tearing like paper. Through his cockpit window, he watched a German Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter flash past, its wingtip missing, trailing smoke and fire as it plummeted toward the sand dunes below. But the German pilot's final act of desperation had achieved something that should have been impossible. The enemy fighter had sliced clean through the All-American's fuselage, nearly severing the entire tail section from the main body of the aircraft. 20 feet behind Bragg's seat, his B-17 was held together by nothing more than a few twisted cables and thin strips of aluminum skin. Before we continue with this incredible story of survival against impossible odds, I need you to do something. Hit that like button right now, drop a comment below, and tell me what you think happened to this crew flying in an aircraft that was literally cut in half. And make sure you subscribe to this channel because we're bringing you the most incredible, untold stories from World War II that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about what's possible in combat. Now let's get back to that moment when 10 American airmen found themselves flying home in a flying fortress that had become two separate pieces held together by a prayer. To understand the magnitude of what happened over Tunisia that day, you need to understand what the B-17 Flying Fortress represented in 1943. This was not just an airplane. This was America's answer to Hitler's war machine, a four-engine strategic bomber designed to carry the fight deep into enemy territory and return home with its crew intact. The Boeing B-17 had earned its nickname through brutal trial by fire over the skies of Europe and North Africa. With its distinctive chin turret, dorsal and tail gun positions, and armor plating protecting vital systems, the Flying Fortress was built to survive what no aircraft should be able to survive. But on February 1st, 1943, that philosophy would face its ultimate test. The 97th Bombardment Group had launched that morning from their base in Algeria, part of a larger mission to strike German positions around Tunis. This was strategic bombing at its most dangerous. Daylight precision attacks against heavily defended targets with minimal fighter escort and maximum enemy opposition. The crews who flew these missions knew the statistics. Bomber Command calculated that a crew had roughly a 25% chance of completing their required 25 missions. 3 out of every 4 men who climbed into a B-17 would not live to see home again. They flew anyway because the mission demanded it, because democracy required it, and because American industrial might had given them the tools to take the fight to fascism's doorstep. Lieutenant Bragg and his crew expected flak. They expected fighter attacks. They expected mechanical failures, navigational challenges, and the constant fear that came with flying a lumbering bomber through skies controlled by the enemy. What they did not expect was to witness the laws of physics being rewritten in real time. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighter that struck them had been damaged in an earlier engagement, its pilot likely wounded or his aircraft crippled. Instead of breaking off the attack, the German pilot chose to ram his fighter directly into the American bomber's fuselage. It was a desperate act that should have killed everyone aboard both aircraft instantly. The collision occurred at precisely 13:47 hours, recorded in the mission log with clinical precision that belied the chaos of the moment. The German fighter's wing sliced through the B-17's fuselage just aft of the radio compartment, cutting through structural frames, severing control cables, and destroying the aircraft's structural integrity. The physics involved were straightforward. A 6,000-pound fighter traveling at 300 miles per hour collided with a 65,000-pound bomber flying at 180 miles per hour. The kinetic energy released was equivalent to a direct hit from a large artillery shell. The All-American should have broken apart immediately, its crew dead before they could comprehend what had happened. Instead, something unprecedented occurred. The B-17's tail section completely severed from the main fuselage, except for a few control cables and strips of aluminum skin, remained attached to the aircraft. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, found himself in a section of aircraft that was connected to the rest of the plane by materials never intended to bear such stress. The entire aft portion of the aircraft, including the tail guns, elevators, rudder, and vertical stabilizer, was held in place by cables designed to operate flight controls, not support the weight of major structural components. In the cockpit, Lieutenant Bragg faced a situation no pilot training had prepared him for. His aircraft's center of gravity had shifted dramatically. The structural damage meant that normal flight controls responded in unpredictable ways. The elevator cables, now bearing the weight of the entire tail section, transmitted control inputs through a pathway never intended for such loads. Every adjustment of the control yoke sent vibrations through the damaged airframe that threatened to complete the separation the German fighter had begun. The immediate question was whether the aircraft could maintain flight. Standard aerodynamic principles suggested the answer was no. The B-17's design relied on structural integrity throughout the fuselage to distribute flight loads and maintain control authority. With the fuselage severed, the aircraft should have entered an uncontrollable spin or broken apart under the stress of continued flight. Instead, the All-American continued flying, albeit with flight characteristics unlike anything any pilot had ever experienced. Flight Engineer Technical Sergeant William Leake began an immediate damage assessment while the aircraft struggled to maintain altitude and heading. The starboard horizontal stabilizer was gone completely. The port stabilizer was damaged but functional. The vertical fin remained intact, held in position by cables that were stretching under loads far exceeding their design limits. Most critically, the elevator control surfaces were responding to pilot input, but with significant delay and reduced authority. The aircraft could be controlled, but just barely and only within very narrow parameters. What followed was a masterclass in crew coordination under impossible circumstances. Navigator Second Lieutenant Harold Sandstrom plotted a course to the nearest Allied airfield while calculating whether the damaged aircraft could maintain sufficient altitude to clear the Atlas Mountains between their position and safety. Radio operator Technical Sergeant Robert Bentz transmitted emergency signals while monitoring German radio frequencies to track enemy fighter activity. Ball turret gunner Staff Sergeant Elton Conda confirmed that the Messerschmitt had been destroyed in the collision, eliminating the immediate threat of follow-up attacks. But the most precarious position belonged to tail gunner Hugh Eckenrode, isolated in the severed rear section with no way to communicate with the rest of the crew except through hand signals passed along by waist gunners Staff Sergeant Mario Barbosa and Staff Sergeant Samuel Sarpolis. Eckenrode was essentially flying in a separate aircraft that happened to be connected to the main fuselage by materials never intended to support his weight, let alone the weight of his gun turret and ammunition load. The engineering marvel that saved their lives lay in the B-17's original design philosophy. Boeing engineers had built the Flying Fortress with massive structural redundancy, understanding that combat damage was inevitable and that crews needed every possible chance of survival. The aircraft's frame incorporated multiple load paths for critical systems. When the primary structural elements were severed by the German fighter, secondary and tertiary systems took over the load distribution. Control cables, designed to operate flight surfaces, became makeshift structural supports. Aluminum panels, intended primarily for aerodynamic smoothness, became critical load-bearing elements holding the aircraft together. This redundancy had never been tested under conditions like those facing the All-American. Boeing engineers had designed for battle damage, but not for complete structural separation. What they had unknowingly created was an aircraft capable of surviving damage that should have been instantly fatal. The B-17 systems continued functioning even when the aircraft's basic structural integrity had been compromised beyond any reasonable expectation of survival. As the damaged bomber limped toward Allied territory, Lieutenant Bragg faced increasingly difficult flight control challenges. The aircraft's center of gravity had shifted aft due to the severed fuselage, making the plane nose-heavy and difficult to control in pitch. The reduced elevator authority meant that normal landing procedures would be impossible. Any attempt at a standard approach would likely enter into an unrecoverable dive or the remaining structural connections failing failing under the stress of maneuvering. The decision was made to attempt an emergency landing at Biskra, Algeria, the nearest Allied airfield with a runway long enough to accommodate a B-17. The approach would have to be flown at higher than normal speed to maintain control authority with minimal maneuvering and no opportunity for a second attempt. If the landing attempt failed, there would be no chance to go around and try again. The aircraft's structural condition made it a one-shot proposition.
Ground crews at Biskra watched in disbelief as the All-American appeared on final approach. From a distance, the aircraft looked relatively normal. Only as it drew closer did the full extent of the damage become apparent. The fuselage was completely severed, the tail section visibly separated from the main body of the aircraft. What they were witnessing should have been aerodynamically impossible. No aircraft could fly in such condition. Yet here was a B-17 flying fortress making a controlled approach with all engines running and landing gear extended. The landing itself demonstrated Lieutenant Bragg's exceptional piloting skill and the B-17's remarkable engineering. Touching down at 120 miles per hour, significantly faster than normal to maintain control authority, the All-American rolled down the runway with its severed tail section bouncing and flexing behind the main aircraft. The stress of ground contact and deceleration should have completed the separation begun by the German fighter. Instead, the makeshift structural connections held until the aircraft rolled to a complete stop. When ground crews reached the aircraft, they found all 10 crew members alive and largely uninjured. Staff Sergeant Eckenrode climbed out of his tail gunner position, having survived an experience unlike anything in aviation history. He had essentially flown as a passenger in a separate aircraft connected to the main plane by cables and aluminum strips, trusting his life to structural elements never designed to bear such loads. The post-mission inspection revealed the full magnitude of what had occurred. The German fighter had cut through 95% of the B-17's fuselage cross-section. Only a narrow strip of aluminum skin on the port side remained intact, along with the control cables that had become inadvertent structural supports. The aircraft had flown approximately 90 minutes in this condition, covering over 200 miles while maintaining formation discipline and executing a successful emergency landing. From an engineering perspective, the All-American survival represented a validation of design principles that Boeing's engineers had incorporated without fully understanding their ultimate implications. The structural redundancy built into the B-17 had created multiple failure modes that could absorb catastrophic damage while maintaining essential aircraft functions. This was not luck. This was the result of engineering decisions made years earlier by designers who understood that combat aircraft needed to be able to survive the unsurvivable. The implications extended far beyond a single remarkable survival story. The All-American incident provided invaluable data about aircraft structural behavior under extreme conditions. The fact that control cables could serve as structural supports opened new possibilities for aircraft design. The demonstration that an aircraft could maintain flight with massive fuselage damage influenced damage tolerance requirements for future military aircraft. More immediately, the survival of Lieutenant Bragg and his crew had practical impact on bomber operations in the Mediterranean theater. The 97th Bombardment Group learned that B-17s could survive damage previously considered fatal, influencing decisions about when to attempt recovery versus abandoning aircraft. Crews gained confidence in their aircraft's ability to bring them home even after sustaining what appeared to be catastrophic damage. The story of the All-American also demonstrated the critical importance of crew training and coordination. The successful emergency landing required precise execution by every crew member, from the pilot maintaining control of a barely flyable aircraft to the tail gunner trusting his life to structural connections that defied engineering logic. This was not just a triumph of American engineering, it was a testament to American military training and the individual courage of 10 men who refused to give up when faced with impossible circumstances. But perhaps most significantly, the All-American represented something larger than aviation engineering or military tactics. In February 1943, the outcome of World War II remained very much in doubt. American forces were still establishing themselves in North Africa. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany was in its early stages with questionable effectiveness and mounting losses. Every mission was a test of American resolve and industrial capability against a determined enemy fighting on familiar ground. The fact that an American bomber could survive being literally cut in half and still complete its mission sent a powerful message about American determination and technological superiority. The B-17 Flying Fortress had lived up to its name in the most dramatic way possible. If American aircraft could survive such damage and American crews could overcome such odds, what could the enemy ultimately do to them? The symbolism extended to the home front as well. News of the all-American survival, while carefully censored to avoid revealing tactical information to the enemy, provided powerful propaganda value. American factory workers building B-17s could take pride in creating aircraft capable of bringing crews home, even after sustaining impossible damage. American families with sons flying combat missions could find hope in the knowledge that American engineering provided their boys with the best possible chance of survival. The technical lessons learned from the All-American incident influenced B-17 modifications and maintenance procedures throughout the war. Boeing engineers studied the damage patterns and structural behavior to better understand how their aircraft performed under extreme conditions. Maintenance crews learned to pay closer attention to control cable condition and routing, understanding that these systems might serve as emergency structural supports under combat conditions. For the men who flew the mission, the experience provided both trauma and inspiration that would last their entire lives. Lieutenant Bragg continued flying combat missions until completing his tour, but he never forgot the feeling of controlling an aircraft that should not have been able to fly. His successful handling of the emergency established him as one of the most skilled pilots in the 97th Bombardment Group and earned him rapid promotion and additional responsibilities. Staff Sergeant Eckenrode faced a different kind of challenge. Having survived an experience that defied explanation, he struggled with the psychological impact of realizing how close he had come to death. The tail gunner position was always dangerous, but flying in a severed section of aircraft connected only by cables created a unique form of vulnerability that few humans have ever experienced. His successful adaptation to continued combat flying demonstrated the resilience that characterized his generation of American servicemen. The All-American itself never flew again. The structural damage was too extensive for repair, and the aircraft was scrapped for spare parts. But its legacy lived on in every B-17 that completed its missions and brought its crew home safely. The engineering principles demonstrated by the All-American survival were incorporated into future aircraft designs, while the story of its survival became part of the folklore that sustained bomber crews through the most dangerous missions of the war. From a broader historical perspective, the All-American incident represented a turning point in the strategic bombing campaign. The demonstration that American bombers could survive unprecedented damage while maintaining operational effectiveness validated the strategic decision to pursue daylight precision bombing despite heavy losses. If aircraft could survive being cut in half, they could certainly survive the flak and fighter attacks that characterized normal combat operations. The incident also highlighted the importance of crew training and aircraft design working together to maximize survival probability. The All-Americans crew succeeded because they had been trained to handle emergencies that their instructors had never imagined. Their aircraft survived because it had been designed by engineers who understood that combat would test their creation in ways that peacetime testing could never. The story resonated throughout American popular culture as well. The image of a bomber flying home despite being cut in half became a powerful metaphor for American determination and industrial capability. Magazine articles, radio broadcasts, and eventually movies drew inspiration from the All-American survival, using it as an example of what American technology and American courage could accomplish when working together. But for aviation historians and engineers, the All-American represented something more specific and technical. The incident provided unique data about aircraft structural behavior under conditions that could never be safely replicated in testing. The fact that control cables could serve as structural supports influenced designs for decades afterward. The demonstration that an aircraft could maintain flight with massive fuselage damage changed assumptions about damage tolerance and emergency procedures. The engineering analysis of the All-American survival revealed the importance of redundant load paths in aircraft design. Boeing's engineers had created multiple ways for structural loads to be transmitted throughout the airframe, ensuring that the failure of primary structural elements would not necessarily result in complete aircraft loss. This design philosophy became standard practice in military aircraft development and influenced civilian aircraft design as well. The human factors aspects of the incident were equally important. The successful emergency landing required split-second decision-making under extreme stress, precise crew coordination with limited communication capability, and individual courage in the face of seemingly certain death. These elements became part of